We have a lot of deep thinkers in this crowd, right? We must. Look at all the questions we have. We've only got an hour and 15 minutes, but we'll try to get through most, if not all, of your questions. I know that's hard because we have 3 people here who have so much knowledge that it might be a little, the answers may be a bit long, but we're going to try. And some of them are addressed to all 3 panelists. In that case, maybe just, a brief comment, as brief as possible, from each person on a particular question. And I think the first one really ties into our theme, which is connecting science and spirituality. And the first question for all 3 panelists, would you all share your respective perspectives on our weekend topic, how each approach can lead to the same ultimate sense of unity or this connectedness between science and spirituality? And Pat hands Amit the microphone.
Well, I think that science and spirituality, got to be integrable because there cannot be 2 worldviews, obviously. But that does not mean that in the way to integration, we shouldn't go through a multicultural phase. I think anthropologists have been very good for us to show that there is a cultural component to every aspect of human knowledge. So on the way to truth, before we are in truth consciousness, we are, as you know, going through a mental phase of evolution. In the mental phase, we cannot know truly. So it requires a quantum leap to know, to get to the truth consciousness, which is supramental, which Blavatsky called higher mind. We are in the lower mind, so to speak. So that makes it difficult, and that makes it imperative that we are very tolerant to each other, we keep an open mind, and we be nice to others who have a different view. So I respect the points of view of my co-panelists, and but I think, of course, I'm right. I'm the only one. Now, kidding aside, I think that eventually we'll have a integration that everybody will agree. Right now, to me, quantum physics is giving us every indication that we are close. We are close to integrating science and spirituality in a very true sense, because something of theory has been verified in the laboratory. That is a very good sign that a new science can be built in which science and spirituality are integrated from the get-go, because we start with a spiritual axiom as fundamental basis of the science. Consciousness is the ground of all being. That enables us to integrate science and spirituality from the beginning. Quantum physics has this power. So I would like all of you to appreciate the gift that quantum physics is giving us. Whether this gift will become the new paradigm of science, that of course depends on many, many other verifications and agreements and consensus building, and that may take a while. Thank you.
I would actually defer to my 2 esteemed colleagues on either side, because they're representing the world of science for us. And I think that if you think a generation ago or so, most of the scientists I know will talk about their spirituality, but they won't go public with it and they won't make the connection. So I want to acknowledge the great gifts we're given by our 2 colleagues here who are doing that for us.
Amen.
This may not be polite for me to say, but this is really a lazy person's question. Twice for nearly an hour and a half each time I have tried to say, and now you want me to summarize this. There can hardly really be any reason for any contradiction between these 2 statements. And the precisely one surface, naturally varies from person to person. And even quite prior to quantum mechanics having been conceived, practically all the great scientists were very much spiritually oriented.
Okay, then Patricia, maybe you've got something to say about this one. What role does chaos have in the oneness of everything and the uniqueness of each thing and their integration?
That person should just publish that question as a poem, I think. Well, I'm a poet and not a chaos scientist, so I'm the interpreter into words of other people's ideas, so I'm going to do the best I can. It seems to me that if you take the idea of self-similarity, we are all iterations of some human form. We're all different, and we're all the same. In the same way, the shapes, the angles of the tree are the same. So we're unified by the pattern of our humanness, but we're all different. So I think that that part of chaos theory, the fractal geometry part, gives us an image for talking about human difference that also can talk about human unity, that we're all part of the same humanity. You know, ultimately, we're all part of the same global consciousness, the same universe, but each one of us is that variation on the form.
Okay. I think this one would be for Ravi. How can we transcend our uniqueness to our oneness in brotherhood without denying our individuality?
I think one of the things I was actually trying to say this morning, and in any case, is part and parcel of the great traditions, that any real understanding of oneness of all there is doesn't deny our uniqueness. In fact, even though logically or purely at the level of the language it may so appear, which is also the reason for always thinking a little bit differently than purely rationally or in a logic that is only yes and no. And that uniqueness is actually a feature of oneness. So there is no need to transcend this in any requirement of this. In fact, if you celebrate, this is just a matter of speaking in that language, if you celebrate the glory of God in your own unique way, this is how you honor what is underlying all reality. As Amit was so passionately saying, the ground of all being, that consciousness, label it God, Brahma, that how do we celebrate this? Not by everybody doing the same thing, but uniquely bringing whatever one's contribution can be.
Okay, for Amit, this is a little long, so if you need me to repeat something, I can do that. You said that part of our evolution toward becoming a better representation of God involves the ahas and creative insights, revelations, etc. In your opinion, do we all have access to these ahas if we listen and practice to see beyond? Or are we given grace for these ahas? If so, does this grace come as a reward for our practices? Or is it randomly given? Wow, we have a lot of questions. We've got grace and randomness, and that's great.
This is a very, very good question.
It is a
There
good
is
question.
always an amount of grace involved in creativity. There's no denying it. There is no cause-effect connection of how much work you put into it or how good you become, do, that it will require a quantum leap from you every now and then, and we can predict it. Creativity is interesting because it always comes with aha. It's always a surprise that you got it finally. And when you get it finally, you know that you didn't get it. It's not you. It's not in your ego. It's always comes as that grace gave it to me. This is why creative people always say, by the grace of God. By the grace of God, it came like a bolt of thunder. It's like that. All creative people describe things like that, their discoveries. Einstein made it very clear when he said, I didn't discover relativity by rational thinking alone. Cannot be done. Now, everybody has the potential for it. This is the part that I emphasize. So the research makes it very clear, and quantum physics confirms it, that if we really get into this habit of do, alternating it, then we are bound to. This I can promise you, that you're bound to get into flow. And then it's just the intensity of your encounter with God that determines what will come out of it. If you hold the creative question intensely, then you're bound to see all of it, all of God's gift to you. What happens to us, and I can vouch for it personally, is that with our limited capacities, we capture portions of it. I'm really amazed how, during the process of working on a book, how I never get the whole idea all at the same time. Maybe an Einstein could. I don't get it that way. I get many, many mini quantum leaps, but it comes. Eventually, everything falls together. And the funny thing is that sometimes, an idea comes and I would write it down tentatively, and only later I would realize that this was actually an aha experience, which I didn't even recognize in the first, when it came. So the process is wonderful. And something else I want to throw at you, which is that it is an evolutionary demand on us that we all become much more creative. In the morning, you were talking about creativity becoming much, much more acceptable in society, more and more people becoming creative. This is part of evolution, I think. So the questioner is to be congratulated, and my advice to you is go at it.
There you go. Thank you. Very good. Well, I'll let anyone answer this one. It's kind of interesting. The cow, quote unquote, is currently standing on one leg, Kali Yuga. When will the cow be again on four legs? Anyone know that cow?
Now, William Blake said it even better. It's single vision and Newton's sleep. We are in that. We are doing that, but we are also waking up. So, don't pay too much attention to the sleeping people. They are waking, but gradually, slower than you. That's all.
Either of the other two have any responses?
Well, I would say you should answer the question by asking yourself what you're doing. And you're going to be part of the waking up or not.
Any comments, Ravi? No. No comment from Ravi. Okay, this is for Amit or Ravi, or if you would both, I would invite you both to answer this. In the introduction to Fritjof Capra's Tao of Physics, he says that physicists can create the bomb or Buddha. What do you think of this comment? Do you agree? Are more scientists beginning to work on the Buddha aspect?
All right. This kind of statement, people can sometimes get away with it, but it really doesn't make very much sense. I don't think the Buddha can be quite created by physics or physicists or any such thing. This is just nonsensical way of speaking if it was actually there, which I don't quite know. So I'm taking your word for it. It is certainly true that physics has unveiled or made available to us an enormous amount of power, and that it can be used for destructive purposes, so the bomb becomes just a symbol for that. But that it could also be used for good purposes. In fact, both exist in the society. So that really what is more and more mandatory is that we would have cultivation of compassion and wisdom along with the availability of this power. To say whether the tomorrow's Nobel Prize winners in physics are more compassionate than yesterday's, that's really largely hit and miss. They could be, they could not be.
But to give a little bit of hand for Bishop Kapra, I think he was saying the same thing as you said, metaphorically. I think the metaphor more means that physicists can be conducive to a worldview which separates, and a bomb separates more than anything else, or can contribute to a worldview which supports love, Buddha's compassion. So I think we're saying the same thing.
Okay. This one is to Ravi. Do you think that the world or society today would respond differently to a physical incarnation of Jesus? Was it fear that caused people to crucify such a great embodiment of love? There's kind of two questions there. Do you think the world would accept a Jesus today?
I don't think so, really. We have had, maybe some of you are familiar with Dostoevsky's brother Karamazov, which is not quite today, but it is closer to our times. And his whole novel is actually dealing with this very theme. If Jesus were to come today, how would he be received? No, I think the issues are really stronger than that, because Christ was, after all, pointing to a whole dimension of reality, which is not what we are usually either accustomed to or wish to proceed in. His classic remark of "my kingdom is not of this world." And I think, I don't know really whether so easily we would nowadays. It'll be naturally slightly different language, different appearance, all that. That is to be expected. But whether we are now more freed of our attachment to egotism or to this world or superficiality, these are just different ways of saying the same thing. That we are now freer of this than his contemporaries were, I think I need to be persuaded of this.
Okay. Anybody have any thoughts on, or was it fear that caused people to
I was just
crucify?
imagining, what if Jesus came as a, shaved head lesbian? I mean, the fact was that Jesus didn't represent the approved way to be. And I think part of the message is to open our hearts to those different from us. And I'm not sure, I'm inclined to be pessimistic like Ravi. I'm not sure that, an immigrant named Jesus would not be crucified.
Would people respond to the embodiment of the Antichrist? Mm.
Shall I try to persuade you, Ravi? Well, there are two sides to the question. I mean, do you want to be an optimist or do you want to be pessimist? I have become persuaded, completely persuaded, that there is evolution of consciousness. How much evolution has taken place in 2,000 years? A tremendous amount, really. One of my colleagues, when I first came to America a long time ago, used to tell me, just for shaking me up, sort of, about American consciousness. He used to say that a weakling, referring to my physical body, like you would not survive a day if you came here 100 years ago. And that was the truth, because it was dominated by robust people, and meek people had no place, men especially. I mean, women were supposed to be meek, that's okay. So from that, we have come to this consciousness. It's an amazing progress, even in 100 years. So when you think of how much you have progressed 2,000 years, I think you can safely say that a Jesus phenomenon with that kind of awareness that Jesus represented probably would become very well known, controversial, of course, because the fundamentalists would never recognize Jesus. So very controversial figure. But thanks to the internet and thanks to conferences, thanks to scientists also who will support this, thanks to people like Ravi, who would recognize such a person, we would, I think, have a very good chance of recognizing an unusual person as an avatar of God. That I do not know. But should we recognize avatars of God? We don't need to, because avatars of God speak for themselves.
Okay. And even if we recognize them, then would we treat them any differently? Or are we that evolved? I mean, I think you're saying that this person would be treated differently because you're treated differently.
We certainly would not kill him. We certainly would not kill him. This much I can guarantee you, that we have changed that much. I mean, it's true that Iranians in this day and age did threaten to kill someone rashly, but nobody actually did. Just look at the situation. Nobody actually did kill him. And so many people could. But we are not in that consciousness anymore. My wife always says that we are still eating meat. But that's a minor thing, really. And I think even that is passing. The strangest thing, we went to Sedona before coming here, and there was a vegan restaurant in Sedona. So, we really are progressing, I think. But again, I'm an optimist.
We need the world to be optimistic, don't we? I like the optimist. This is kind of interesting in thinking about the boundaries. This person asked, what is the boundary between the inside and the outside? And we heard earlier that, is it our skin? And yet, we all exchange the same air that we share with all of the other the animals, the plants. We even exchange air with plants, that kind of thing. And if we live in an unbounded universe, an expanding universe, what is the boundary between inside and outside? And does an inside even really exist, I would add?
I think we need to take quite seriously, really, what Amit Goswami was talking about maybe an hour ago now, that it is entirely possible and reasonable to say that everything is inside us. Then, at different times with different operations of the mind, we can, as it were, materialize things outside.
I once read, and I can't remember the source exactly, the idea that with every breath, you are breathing in an atom of Jesus' sandal, and an atom that was once breathed in by the Buddha. We're literally connected when we breathe. So that's something to never forget. In meditation, that's something that often comes back to me.
Do you have any comments on it?
Well, actually, yeah, I mean, we are connected that way locally, but even better, we are connected non-locally all the time. Only thing is that we have to trigger it. We don't usually trigger it for good reasons because we go crazy, literally. If everyone is connected to everyone else, just think about it, how the psyche would look like. We're always speaking of thoughts and energies. I know a few people who are energy sensitive. Life is very difficult that way. So we are not ready yet. Mechanism cannot handle non-locality all the time. On the other hand, it's a very good thing to learn to tune into that non-locality when you need it. This is called appropriate action in Buddhism. Buddha was once asked, not Buddha, Buddhists and Jains in India. Jain is another language which is similar but not quite to Buddhism. And they often fight with each other, not like Muslims and Christians fight with each other. Their ways are non-violence. It's a non-violent combat. But they try to show that Buddha is better and Jain's founder is Mahavir, he is better. And they do it this way. It's a beautiful story, so I'll try to be as quick as possible. I remember your dictum of, sorry about that.
Oh, we're doing good.
But anyway, the story is that Jains say that Mahavir is better because it's like the artist who was told to draw a picture and which is already very good, and how does one top it? So the Jain painter drew this picture by just having a mirror in front of it. And the mirror captures every bit of the picture. And he was praised by the king enormously that, it's so wonderful. And so Mahavir is praised because it's like this reflection of everything. All knowledge is captured in it. Mind is so pure that it reflects everything. But Buddhists have an answer to this. Buddhists say that if all knowledge is captured every time and everything, then it's a huge load. Why carry the burden all the time when all you need is to have that particular knowledge come to you when it is appropriate? So Buddhism is about appropriate action. Now, this is very important to remember.
Great, thank you. This one is for Patricia, and it gets into Blavatsky and a bit of the secret doctrine. Blavatsky speaks in the secret doctrine of chaos, theos, and cosmos, that the void, or chaos, is the container of the universe with its 7 principles, that chaos and space are synonymous. She says that chaos became the soul of the world, according to Plato and Pythagoras. Chaos, theos, cosmos are but the 3 aspects of their synthesis, space. Would Patricia, Amit, Ravi? Patricia maybe can start.
I'll start, but somewhere along the line, the word chaos started to mean not that primordial soup from which all form emerged, but it got to represent disorder. It got to have that meaning. And I've been trying to track exactly when that happened because there was a shift in meaning. When you go back to the ancients, and Blavatsky did in the perennial wisdom, really, the sense of chaos was much closer to what scientists mean by that than what is commonly used. The common use of the term really means disorder. And yet when you go back to Hesiod talking about, everything coming forth from chaos, joining with Eros, that's a very strong and powerful image for picturing the world, to say that when the great possibility joins with love, that's when everything comes forth. And I think that's what we are individually trying to do, is reach the point where from our own primordial chaos, we interact with love with the rest of the world and with other people, creating new forms. And I'd like to say that I have figured out when that shift took place. I slip too. I say things are chaotic when I mean they're disordered. That's the common use, and that's not the ancient use. So really, Blavatsky was right on target with the perennial wisdom with that.
Amit, Ravi, go ahead.
No, I don't really, I would refer this to Betty Bland to answer this question. She knows much more about the secret doctrine than I do.
Amit, do you have any comments? I saw you vigorously shaking your head while Patricia was talking.
I agree with what she said.
Amit agrees with what Patricia said. Okay. Okay. Matsuro Emoto, and I'm assuming everybody knows who that is, the water experiment guy, did experiments where changes in water in one location resulted in similar changes in water in a separate location. So I'm assuming this person's kind of going for the non-local thing here. Since our bodies/brains are composed of a high percentage of water, do you think water plays a role in situations such as the example you gave, where a person sitting in one room registered the light flashes seen by a person sitting in a separate room?
What a beautiful question, and very perceptive. When I first saw Dr. Emoto's data, I was a little skeptic. And since we both participated in the same project, I would often be asked, what is your view on it? And I would not answer it because I didn't want to say anything negative, being an optimistic person. But I, on the other hand, had no idea how such a thing could happen. But then I was invited at a conference on dowsing, and somehow they persuaded me to give a talk. And initially I thought I'll just talk on what I talk on regularly, quantum consciousness, and not worry about dowsing. But the phenomenon intrigued me so much, and at that same time, I had previously studied a phenomenon called homeopathy, with whom I'm sure you are familiar. And I studied vital energy and how it is captured in homeopathic medicine quite a bit. And suddenly it occurred to me that dowsing is just an extension of that same phenomenon. Water can, under suitable circumstances, capture vital energy in the sense that it becomes correlated with it. So when one says that water retains memory, they're not talking about memory that we usually mean by memory, changes in molecules. But the changes in molecules occur also, but they are occurring because they're correlated with vital energies, which are human emotions. So it's actually a correlation of human emotions, human brains, similar to that Jacobo-Greenberg experiment, that is producing the similarity of the water molecular structure in two different places. But to see it, to appreciate your question, I had to go through a little personal history. To see it, I had to do quite a bit of research. Thank you. That's very insightful.
Thank you. Anyone else have any comments on non-locality? This is a theosophical question. What makes theosophy theosophical? Okay. How do the writings of the early theosophists shape, and I don't know how early they mean, because Blavatsky borrowed that word. I mean, it's not a brand new word that she just made up. I think I'm correct in saying that. So how do the writings of the early theosophists shape and define what theosophy is today, or what distinguishes theosophy from similar philosophical systems? And I realize we have a lot of people here today who are new to theosophy, who are very interested in the scientific studies that theosophy undertakes, because that was one of Blavatsky's big things, was science. It's amazing the studies that she did when she put together the secret doctrine. So does anyone have any thoughts on that? What makes theosophy a theosophical? And how is Theosophy different from similar philosophical systems? Are there similar philosophical systems?
I would take the initiative to say something very positive about Theosophy. The reason I love coming to Theosophical conferences and mingling with Theosophists, it is because from the get-go, this is one spiritual tradition which has been built from the get-go with an integration of scientific and spiritual worldview as one of the main goals. That has never happened before Theosophy in human history. After Theosophy, yes, religious science is based on the same idea, Ernest Holmes, and they have a beautiful system also, and many others. But I think Theosophists, if I'm not completely wrong, I'm not good in history, I'm not saying that, but I think Theosophists were the first to make it an avowed part of a system of knowledge that could be called a spiritual system or a spiritual way to spiritual knowledge.
I would just really add only, first of all, to really underscore what Amit just said. This is actually quite important point to, in fact, value the scientific perspective on spiritual matters was certainly a very strong component of Theosophy. There is another one which may these days seem like an obvious thing, but it was not so obvious at that time, to honor all the great religious traditions. There is not any sense of a parochialism in it. And of course, more especially, partly because it was really trying to be propagated, trying to bring some of these ideas in the Western cultures, which were very dominant politically and economically, etc., to therefore bring the notion that religious traditions such as of Hinduism or Buddhism also have something of value to add. This may seem obvious these days, but it was not quite so obvious nearly 130 odd years ago when the society was founded. And I would like to add just another sentence or two here, which is not exactly relevant to this question, but I don't really feel that many people are aware of the fact that if it were not for practically the rescue mission by the Theosophical Society, it may well be the case that Buddhism would have completely disappeared.
Yes. Yes, Ed. Well, you certainly may. Just jump right in, Ed. He's always got interesting things to say.
Thank you. Since this is a subject dear to my heart, I'll interrupt quickly and get off because we want to hear our panelists. I think there's a difference, of course, between the Theosophical Society and Theosophy, which should be apparent. Some of the things that are different is that, first of all, H.P. Blavatsky said she was introducing nothing new in the world. She was gathering together the strains of the ancient wisdom that lay in all of the great cultures. Also, in her secret doctrine, she says that it is the synthesis of religion, philosophy, and science. She means by that, as I understand it, she's pointing to the source of all three of those and showing how the source reflects in philosophy, reflects in religion, reflects in science. That, I think, is rather different from any movement I've ever heard of. Thank you.
People should also realize that it was fairly anomalous with the Enlightenment that there was a separation of spirituality and science. Blavatsky and this whole enterprise is really restoring an ancient order. It hasn't been a long time since that was understood to be a natural connection. I think that when you look at the Enlightenment people, and I have a tendency to demonize them a bit myself, but they were coming out of their time, and in their time there was a lot of fundamentalism, such as we experience today, and the experiences of people's ideas being controlled by the church is likely to make people say, well, let's just make a nice divide, and you keep the spirit and we'll keep the mind. I find the fact that Kepler's mother was accused of witchcraft to be kind of an interesting moment in history. And Kepler was himself an astrologer. There was a time when that was not that different, not that unusual. But that changed, and we're really restoring an ancient order. We're not inventing something. Science and spirituality are not different, and they've only just recently had a little separation. So they're coming back together.
That's interesting that they bring up this idea. But if science can coexist with spirituality because of the personal nature of spirituality, can science ever coexist with religion, formal, organized religion, as we know it today with popes, preachers, prophets? You know, does any one of you or all of you have a comment on that?
I think a comment is probably necessary, but you put it so very well. It's probably not necessary. I think that religions can still exist, but religions have to make some major changes, no question. I think religions, for example, those religions who believe that God is perfect, they have to recognize that in perfection, yes, God is perfect, but only as possibilities. In the manifest world, God is not perfect. So we find in manifestation exists wrongness and evil and all this. So religions really have to convince them that evil is not opposite to God. It's just that at our present stage of evolution, imperfections occur. And that may seem like a string of evil, stream of bad things, especially when mind is in control and looks at things in dichotomies like good and evil. It's bound to happen that we'll occasionally see evil and embodiment of evil, that nothing is outside of God. Those kinds of dualistic notions, religions really have to get rid of. But if they do that, like we already have several religions who have been able to do that, most recently the Baha'i religions, and ancient times Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism, and Kabbalah. So the basis of Judeo-Christian religion also is very non-dualistic. All those things are completely compatible with science, if you call them religion, but you could also call them just spiritual traditions. Religion, as we see as religion, their really only problem is, and maybe for saying this I am in trouble already, but it's really fundamentalist Christians and fundamentalist Islam. Those are the two religions which fundamentally is dualistic, but only in that fundamentalist shape. If you read Jesus' teaching, it's just so radiantly idealist in the monistic sense, so radiantly non-dual, that you have absolutely no doubt that this is a connoisseur of reality. But again, the fundamentalists of all religions will not see this. And I'm sorry to say also that, and you would agree with this, Ravi, I hope, that there are many fundamentalists among even Hindus today. Fundamentalism is growing enormously. But this is to be expected, because end of fundamentalist, I think, fundamentalism is in sight, and that is what the job of science. Science is going to eliminate fundamentalism in favor of multiculturalism. We'll have differences of opinion, of course, about which path is the best or greatest and what people should follow the fastest and all this. Fine, and that's to be expected, that's to be welcomed. But the fundamentalist system is inconducive to creativity. That is to be let go, and the quicker the better. We are just kept from our potentials by contributing to fundamentalism.
Very good.
To introduce a slightly feminist note, I want to note that all monotheisms are based on exclusion of the feminine. There's not a single monotheism based on there's a goddess above everybody. So monotheism is based on excluding, and it's kind of inside-outside thing. You also exclude people who don't believe in your God. It's defining who's in and who's out, and who's God and who's not. Miranda Green, who's a marvelous Celticist, has pointed out that monotheism requires the existence of a devil in the sense that it also debases the natural world, because if you imagine that there's God and it's not you, then God has to be somewhere else. And the minute you've got God somewhere else, you've got the possibility of taking this world and just using it as we are today. That if you see an eminent, the divine is everywhere, then you really don't dare just run over everything. That person that you spurn could be God. That tree you cut down could be a dryad. If you think that the divine is elsewhere, then that also means that you're not part of the divine. So really, I think the movement has to be toward inclusiveness in the spiritual sense, as opposed to exclusiveness, my God, not your God.
Well, I first of all wholly agree with both of my colleagues here, but just another remark or two, that it's really somewhat inevitable if we have the notion of monotheism, which by itself is actually a very subtle idea, but it needs to be accompanied by this, that any description is going to be lacking, even the mental description. But the moment that is not the case, it is inevitable, and the history is a very good example of this, that monotheism always psychologically leads to the notion of my theism. Nobody in his right mind would say there is one God and that is your God.
Very good.
Naturally, one would always insist that there is one God and that's my God, or our God, just to be a little bit more inclusive. So this is inevitable. I think religions generally are really quite passé. However, there is large amount of real estate involved, and this is going to take a long time. I look at my own children, and there are many, many friends. I don't think it is of any concern to them whether to label themselves Christians or Hindus or Buddhists. However, they have an enormous sense of a whole inner world that needs to be developed, that could be developed. So anything that, of course, there are dimensions and varieties of spirituality, naturally. However, whatever we would include in a spiritual search, that is very alive and active in them. And I see among many of their friends, often it takes, among many young people these days, the form of maybe taking care of the environment, or even some sense of justice in the world order. For example, this is not specifically about only my children, but both of my kids have spent at least a year as volunteers in poor countries in Africa or in Latin America. And all of their friends are in this category. So I think vital, young, intelligent people are just really not even bothered by the fact whether they are labeled one thing or the other. So I actually do really believe from that point of view that all of these kind of religious labels, they become more or less important. Even now they become important largely at the time of either marriages or funerals. But we would have other ceremonies will evolve and we won't really need these. That's my very strong impression.
Okay. How about this one? How does the concept of Maya or illusion play into consciousness? We're taught that all of this is Maya, illusion, it's just here because we're observers of this phenomenon. So how does the concept of Maya or illusion play into consciousness? Amit, you want to answer that first? Or?
Well, this is also another very good question which quantum physics helps us to understand. Maya is you can call it the mechanism by which the one becomes split into a subject that experiences an object separate from itself. And it happens because there is the mechanism involved in making a quantum observation or collapse closes on itself. It's a self-referential, tangled, hierarchical. These are all words which it will take me a while to explain, so I won't bother. You can read one of my books any one of my books to get an idea of what a tangled hierarchy is. But it is important to recognize that reality comes to us through that tangled hierarchical mechanism, which makes this dualism compulsory. This particular dualism cannot be transcended in experience. It can only be transcended in unconscious, nirvikalpa, without separateness. So, which is deep sleep or deeper samadhis, which seems like sleep but really isn't sleep, that the great mystics describe. So this is the great, great challenge of spiritual traditions, of course. This is where the ultimate goal sometimes is stated of the human being, to achieve that kind of wisdom where that becomes clear beyond tangled hierarchies. But in the meantime, in science we often say that that what you want to be, practice that. So if we want to get beyond tangled hierarchy, it's a good thing for us to at least get rid of simple hierarchy and live that tangled hierarchical being. And again, I notice evolution. This in this 20th century, last century, in 1 century, we learned so much. We almost gave up racism, not quite. We almost gave up sexism, not quite. And we are trying hard to give up phobia about homosexuals. We are trying hard to remove the disparity between rich and poor. We are trying to, and these are all examples of hierarchies disappearing. At the same time, of course, you have to notice that they're also coming back. There's always backlash. But the wisdom there, scientific wisdom there, is that it backlashes, but never to the previous stage. There is progress. And this, I think, one can take heart from. So although fundamentalism is rising in America, for example, and much more strong today in a sense, but you notice that even fundamentalists would not really dare, it's politically incorrect to speak raw sexism or raw racism, right? That actor got in trouble in saying something against Judaism recently. He's a famous actor. I still watch his movies, but it was just politically incorrect, and he had to take back his sentence, right? And that kind of change has happened in our consciousness, and that's evolution.
Any other comments on the concept of Maya or illusion and the role it plays in consciousness?
If it is useful purely etymologically, the root of the word Maya is the same as the root of the word measurement. Through the word meter, it comes through that. And I think if we actually take either the great traditions, which have been saying this forever, and our friend Amit has been saying this at least for the last several years, and said that hardly an hour ago, that what is manifested, therefore what can be measured, is only a very minor aspect of that which is beyond measure. And if you recall, I tried to quote just this morning, or maybe yesterday now, I'm already getting in a time warp here, this remark of that we have had a kind of commitment in the scientific circles that what cannot be measured is not real. But then I also mentioned Shankara's comment that whatever can be measured can't possibly be real. But you see, it changes the whole level of reality. What is one considering really real? So Maya certainly has been often translated as illusion, but strictly speaking, this is really only one meaning of this. It really means lesser reality compared with really real reality. But that is always a reference to something which is in fact beyond measure.
Here's another one of these very scientific questions here. What generated the initial collapse or series of collapses that caused the initial representation of the universe? Or in other words, how did we get from absolute possibility to the point of self-consciousness? That sounds like an Amit question.
Take out the rest of the afternoon if I try to answer you seriously. But it is an interesting consequence of quantum physics that we have the capacity of delayed choice. In other words, the quantum collapse that converts possibility into actual events, if a series of possibilities are connected, then the collapse of it now will collapsing the particular possibility that is relevant now will collapse the entire chain of possibilities that made this particular possibility possible, if that is clear. So in that reckoning, the self-referential quantum measurement, because the nature of self-referential quantum measurement is that it requires a tangled hierarchical apparatus to develop. So obviously at some stage, the living cell had to be possible in possibility. But the possibility of living cell requires the possibility of planet, atmosphere, possibility of a solar system, goes all the way to possibility of the Big Bang. So when that living cell, for the first time, looks at itself in a self-referential quantum measurement, all the way the chain is collapsed. I don't know if I'm making any sense in such short time. But does it jive with your?
Right.
Is that clear? Does that make sense? So anyway, so this is a very, very good question, is what I'm trying to say, and the answers can be given in the quantum physics of things.
I find it very interesting that in so many cultures, there's the eye of God, and the idea that the moment of the probabilities collapse at the moment the observer looks. So God made the world.
Okay. One quick question, and then we'll wrap it up because David Bland has a comment that he would like to pose for the entire panel. And this one's always interesting. Do you know of anyone who is trying to work on Einstein's theory of everything? And besides Stephen Hawking, I guess. And I did hear Fred Alan Wolf in a Science and Consciousness conference in April say that scientists will never discover the theory of everything until they include the mind. And I thought that was a rather interesting comment as well. So is anyone working on this, including the mind?
Well, in a sense, science within consciousness that I've been working on for more than a decade now is a theory of everything. But this theory is a funny scientific theory because from the get-go it says that creativity is possible, and not only possible, is compulsory, and therefore it says that this scientific theory is not, it admits of the immeasurable. It establishes different sets of criterions for what can be science and what cannot be science. It admits, in other words, things which normally you would exclude from science. But I'm a believer of Abraham Maslow's statements that whatever is should be inclusive. Science should be inclusive of that. There should be nothing excluded from scientific explanations as far as we can go. And then the new science just accepts the fact that there are going to be some things where science have to be quiet about because it's no longer within the purview of science, where we do science because we want to help people to how to do it, where science is more at that point a how-to kind of thing. And with creativity, we can say how to only up till a certain point. After that, we say that you do it and proof is in the pudding, if you get the insight. But science cannot give you the insight. Any amount of understanding of the science of creativity will not allow you to have the grace of God, which it takes to get an insight. So in this new science, we accept that. So it's an open science. It's an open-ended science. Very different from the way that we used to do science. This is, of course, according to the vision of Houston Smith and many other thinkers who have been trying to do science this way. Willis Harman, he was a great supporter of this kind of science. So I think we are in the right direction in developing science in a way that can be embracive of everything. But this is not what Stephen Hawking would at all say what science is. I mean, his science is deterministic science. It's a science of control on everything that excludes creativity. And, you know, his God is a determined God. So what can you say about that? You know?
Just like to make one little addition to this comment here of Amit, that really it's not only a question of a science that is going to be changing, it's creative, but what we call everything is also going to be changing. Because the moment one has a very static notion of the universe, this is actually part of the problem. And therefore, my own impression is that there will continue to be interest in the theory of everything, but this will always remain an interesting activity, very creative.
Any comments, Patricia, on the theory of everything? No. You're still working on the theory of something? Okay.
What do you say?
All right, great.
Theory of
Okay.
anything.
Anything, something, anything. Okay, David.
I would just like to pose to you, panelists, the conference has been organized by the Theosophical Society. It had some very specific goals in mind, and I would like to hear from the three of you what you think those of us who claim to be either members of the Theosophical Society or at least supportive of it, what you think we ought to be doing relative to the growing fundamentalism and that's worldwide, and of course what we are experiencing in this country personally.
Thank you, David. Whoa, big one. I think we hit them with one they can't answer. Ravi should answer. Okay, Amit said Ravi needs to answer
Amit
this.
is saying that I should start, so I listen to him now. No, I think if we really try to understand the nature of fundamentalism, that is a very important thing to do, rather than just recoiling from it. And Amit already made some comments about this. I think fundamentalism is almost inevitable because all the great insights in any culture can be and have been understood at many levels. And fundamentalism really is the superficial end of this. It's almost equivalent to superficiality. But there is another aspect of this which is important. Fundamentalism really is a mental idol worship. To make things extremely concrete and not to deviate from this. For example, only 40 people are going to be saved, so it's an exact 40 people are going to be, or some such thing. And all the fundamentalists have extremely rigid and often very concrete notions of what God is, what Christ is, what the Holy Spirit is, or in the Hindu context, the same thing. I should also go on to say here that some religious traditions are actually slightly more prone to fundamentalism. I think biblical traditions actually have this built-in notion into it because of what I said earlier, namely monotheism inevitably leads to a kind of mytheism. However, now the word fundamentalism has really come to mean generally rigid or fanatical attitudes, and which are exclusive of other people's points of view. And this is spread everywhere. So I don't think this is a monopoly of only the biblical religions. But at the root of it is, now this is not something to be taken as a given. I don't know. This is my personal understanding. But I think if we are going to take the matter seriously, we would really have to be clearer and clearer why this arises. And I think it really arises out of rigidity which is rooted in fear. Then, in a certain way, actually it has not been helped very much by the kind of a fundamentalist science, which is very reductionist, very materialist, and has in a way eliminated the person or any sense of purpose or meaning from its operations. And therefore, some of the fundamentalists are almost more frightened by this, more driven into an extreme corner on the other side. And it's really one kind of fundamentalism meeting another kind of fundamentalism. But I think in both cases it actually arises from a wish to control, and on the other hand, a fear that things are out of my control. Now, what can the society as a whole do about it? Well, of course, in a general way, nothing helps more than education. But I feel that it is important to not completely retreat by dismissing them, because that certainly is now a different situation than the TS was in the beginning, where they were driven practically by fundamentalists to move from one country to another, or their headquarters were burnt, or this or that. That is likely not to happen now. This is a change in consciousness, that people are not going to be just killed or headquarters burned or something like this. And can one really have an engagement with them at some intellectual level? I often wish that that were possible, and maybe in some small quarters it is possible. But I think it's a very difficult undertaking. So what we would have to do then is not so much to be trying to convert the die-hard fundamentalists, but to have a preventive action, meaning to make sure that the young people are not driven by fear, that they can really feel freely. This is our world. We can look at it, we can examine it, and that the other people who say different things, believe different things, also have a place, and that the truth can actually be more arrived at by allowing a multiplicity of visions without hanging on to just one point of view.
Okay. Very good. We're just about out of time, so if
This
you
is
got a
going to
couple
be
of
very
quick
short.
comments.
The first poem I learned at 8 years old has seemed very relevant these days. Edward Markham, early 20th century American poet. He drew a circle that shut me out, heretic, rebel, a thing to flout. But love and I had the will to win. We drew a circle that took him in.
I'll just add a quick comment to the very elegant comments already made by my colleagues. But really, fundamentalism is a kind of activism. And it is the poor people's activism, ignorant people's activism. Because in this form of activism, if I can convert everyone to my way of thinking, then I don't have to do anything. I don't have to change anything about myself, which I already know is very hard to do, which I fail to do, which I don't want to do. So that gives rise to fundamentalism. And religions are perfect examples of it. Religions breed fundamentalism for the simple reason that religions are about reaching higher states of consciousness, which are the hardest of all enterprises. And so people automatically, after trying that a little, see how difficult it is, give up and become fundamentalists. Of course, Ravi is completely right. Recently, scientists have become fundamentalists for the same reason, because again, the highest questions of science have now become so hard that most scientists just cannot handle it. Out of that frustration, they start converting people from, in their scientism, the things that they value, their particular belief system, reductionism, what have you. And then the religious fundamentalists became afraid of scientific fundamentalism, out of which grew their terrorist view and so on, all of this. Ravi is so correct about this. So what do we do about it? I think Theosophists have a great deal to contribute because, as has been pointed out earlier from the beginning, it is an open-ended tradition. Science is included, and science ideally, of course, except for materialist science, is open-ended. Science, by definition, is about knowing, and knowing has to be open-ended because that which you're trying to know is open-ended. So if Theosophists just become more and more aware of it, and maybe we should just all make an inner vow of something like, we'll always try to transform while we teach, whatever we teach. That's the purport of quantum activism. The word quantum is just added to acknowledge the idea of personal transformation in whatever you pursue. One should never pursue anything and persuade anybody of anything without having tasted the difficulties in that particular persuasion, difficulties of that particular transformation. So without a transformative attitude, one should not preach or persuade or any of even partake any enterprise, really. And that is necessary to recognize, and that is probably what David is trying to tell us to tell. That, that let us become like that, let us become transformative. I think Madame Blavatsky would smile upon us if she heard it, and I hope she has.